Richard's phone hit the polished tile floor so hard that the battery case popped open and skidded several feet, stopping near a little boy holding a pretzel. The entire corridor seemed to go quiet for one impossible second. My ex-husband stared at the business card in Diane's hand, as if it had suddenly turned into a winning lottery ticket he had thrown away years earlier, only moments before he'd been smiling that familiar, smug smile. "Wow," he'd said, looking me up and down. I can almost smell the desperation. Diane had reached into her oversized designer purse, pulled out one of her boutique's hiring flyers, and tilted her head with that sugary sympathy I'd once mistaken for kindness. "You know, Evelyn," she'd said, "we're looking for someone dependable to help with inventory and customer service. It's $18 an hour. It isn't glamorous, but everyone deserves a fresh start." 3 years earlier, those words might have shattered me. Instead, I smiled. Not the kind of smile that asks for approval. The kind that comes from knowing something the other person doesn't. I slipped a cream-colored business card from my wallet and placed it gently into Diane's hand. She glanced at it casually. Then she blinked. Then she read it again. Evelyn Carter, founder and principal consultant, Carter Retail Solutions. Richard leaned closer to see it. That was when his phone slipped from his fingers. As he stood frozen, I simply said, "Enjoy the rest of your afternoon." Then I walked away. I didn't hurry. I didn't look back. For the first time in decades, I didn't need the last word. That moment looked like revenge to anyone watching. To me, it felt like proof that survival can be quiet. 3 years earlier, I never would have believed I'd feel that way. Back then, I thought my life had ended. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 63 years old, and until my divorce, I believed I understood exactly how the rest of my life would unfold. Richard and I had been married for 35 years. We met in our 20s when neither of us had much more than hope and determination. He was ambitious from the beginning, always talking about promotions and sales goals. I worked in retail management and genuinely enjoyed helping people. I loved organizing stores, training employees, solving problems, and finding little ways to make customers feel welcome. We weren't wealthy. We were ordinary. Looking back now, I think that's what I miss most, not Richard himself, but the ordinary life I thought was permanent. We bought a modest brick house outside Columbus. We raised 2 wonderful children there. We hosted Thanksgiving every year, planted flowers every spring, argued over paint colors, laughed about burned dinners, and worried about paying college tuition. It wasn't perfect. It was real. Somewhere along the way, Richard's career took off. He became a regional sales manager for a manufacturing company that supplied equipment across several Midwestern states. The promotions came steadily, along with nicer hotels, business dinners, and frequent travel. I was proud of him. At least I believed I was. To support his career, I stepped away from my own management position and accepted part-time work closer to home. It seemed like the practical decision. Someone needed to keep life running while Richard chased opportunity. I never kept score. Marriage wasn't supposed to be a competition. Or so I thought. One of the constants throughout those years was Diane. She'd been my closest friend for nearly 20 years. We met through our church's volunteer committee. She was funny, energetic, and always seemed eager to help everyone around her. After her husband passed away unexpectedly, our family practically adopted her. She spent holidays with us. She knew where we kept the spare house key. She watched our grandchildren when they visited. If someone had asked me back then who I trusted most outside my family, I would have answered Diane without hesitation. Funny how betrayal almost always arrives wearing a familiar face. The divorce itself had happened 3 years before the afternoon at the mall, but the cracks had started much earlier. Richard became distant. Not dramatically, just gradually. He answered questions with shorter sentences. He smiled less. Business trips grew longer. Phone calls became private. Whenever I mentioned retirement, he changed the subject. I blamed stress. People our age know how easy it is to explain away warning signs. We tell ourselves marriages go through seasons. We convince ourselves patience will fix what honesty might expose. Then one evening I found a restaurant receipt. 2 dinners. Expensive wine. A date during a week Richard claimed he'd been entertaining clients. Even then, I wanted an innocent explanation. That's who I was. I believed people until they forced me not to. The truth came several weeks later. Not because Richard confessed. Because I saw them together. Their hands intertwined. Their laughter effortless. The look on both their faces wasn't guilt. It was relief. As though they were tired of hiding. The confrontation that followed remains one of the longest evenings of my life. Richard sat across from me at our kitchen table while Diane cried quietly beside him. Not for me. For herself. "I deserve to be happy," Richard finally said. I remember staring at him because after 35 years together, that sentence sounded like it came from a stranger. I asked, "Were you unhappy enough to destroy our family?" He didn't answer. Diane did. At our age, she whispered, nobody should settle. Settle. The word echoed in my mind for months afterward. Had our ordinary life become something to settle for? The divorce happened faster than I expected. Lawyers don't spend much time discussing memories. They divide assets, assign values, reduce decades into paperwork. Richard kept most of the retirement investments connected to his compensation package. I kept the house after refinancing it into my own name, though the mortgage payments suddenly became frightening. Our children tried not to choose sides. I never asked them to. No parent should. Still, every holiday felt different. Every birthday required careful scheduling. Every family photograph contained invisible lines. The first year after the divorce nearly broke me. Not financially, emotionally. I'd wake up each morning wondering who I was if I wasn't someone's wife anymore. Friends meant well. You'll find yourself. Everything happens for a reason. You're stronger than you know. Kind words, but strength doesn't arrive simply because someone predicts it will. It arrives because life refuses to stop demanding it. I spent countless mornings sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold, staring out at the backyard we'd once landscaped together. I thought my useful years were behind me. I thought employers wanted younger people. I thought experience no longer mattered. Mostly I thought Richard had been right to leave. When someone you love decides you're no longer enough, it's amazing how easily you begin believing it yourself. The woman who handed over that business card in the mall wasn't born overnight. She had been built slowly, one difficult morning at a time. But standing there after leaving Richard and Diane behind, I wasn't thinking about victory. I was thinking about the woman I'd once been, and the long road that had somehow led me back to myself. The morning after I ran into Richard and Diane at the mall, I unlocked the door to my office 15 minutes earlier than usual. It wasn't much of an office. I rented a modest suite above an insurance agency in an older brick building on the east side of Columbus. The carpet had seen better decades and the windows overlooked a parking lot instead of a skyline. But every piece of furniture inside belonged to me. Every framed certificate on the wall represented something I had earned after my divorce. Every client file stacked neatly on my desk existed because someone had trusted my judgment. 3 years earlier, I hadn't trusted my own. I set my purse down, brewed a pot of coffee, and caught my reflection in the small mirror hanging beside the coat rack. Richard had expected to find a defeated woman wandering through the mall. Instead, he'd found someone he no longer recognized. The funny thing was, I barely recognized her myself. Success has a way of arriving quietly. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It sneaks in through small victories that seem almost insignificant until one day you look back and realize they added up to an entirely different life. But before that happened, there were months when I wasn't sure I wanted to get out of bed. People often imagine betrayal as one terrible day. It isn't. It's hundreds of ordinary days that follow. Days when you reach for the second coffee mug before remembering no one else lives there anymore. Days when neighbors stop asking questions because they don't know what to say. Days when you hear your own house creak at night and realize silence has become another roommate. After the divorce, I avoided grocery shopping on Friday evenings because that had always been Richard and my routine. We'd wander the aisles arguing over brands of pasta sauce, buying more dessert than we needed, and talking about the weekend. I couldn't bear seeing couples doing something that ordinary. Even church became difficult. Some people hugged me too tightly. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A few couldn't hide their curiosity. No matter how kind people meant to be, I always felt like the woman everyone whispered about after the service. The woman whose husband had left her for her best friend. That label felt heavier than my own name. One afternoon, my daughter Melissa stopped by with homemade chicken soup. She found me sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by unopened mail. "You haven't even looked at these," she said gently. "I'll get to them." "When?" I shrugged. She sat across from me. "Mom, I know you're hurting." "I'll be fine." "No," she said softly. "You'll survive, that's different." Her words stayed with me long after she'd gone home. She was right. Surviving wasn't the same as living. Still, I had no idea how to begin again. The practical reality was impossible to ignore. The mortgage needed to be paid. The water heater eventually failed. Property taxes didn't care about heartbreak. For the first time in decades, every financial decision rested entirely on my shoulders. I updated my resume and sent applications to retailers around Columbus. Most never replied. A few invited me to interviews. Nearly every interview ended the same way. We're looking for someone with more recent management experience. We've decided to move in another direction. We appreciate your interest. One hiring manager couldn't have been more than 30 years old. He smiled politely and said, "You're certainly qualified, Mrs. Carter. We just think you'll be happier somewhere with less responsibility." Less responsibility. I'd spent 35 years managing a household, raising children, balancing budgets, training employees, solving customer complaints, organizing inventory, and helping my husband build his career. Apparently, none of that counted anymore. I drove home fighting tears, not because I wanted that particular job, because I suddenly felt invisible. About 6 months after the divorce, I wandered into a small independent bookstore to escape a thunderstorm. The owner was an older gentleman named Frank. His store smelled like coffee, old paper, and polished wood. While I browsed the business section, he struck up a conversation. "You look like someone carrying a heavy load." I laughed awkwardly. "Is it that obvious?" "Only because I carried one myself after my wife died." We talked for nearly an hour. He asked about my work history. I told him I'd spent decades in retail management before stepping back to support my family. "So you've helped stores make money, I suppose." "You've trained people?" "Yes. Managed inventory. For years." "Improved sales?" "I did." He leaned back and smiled. "Then why are you asking someone else to hire you?" I frowned. "I don't understand." "Because," he said, "it sounds like you've spent your whole life solving other people's business problems." I chuckled. "I'm 60. 60 isn't broken." "I'm 63 now," I corrected with a smile as I remember that conversation. He laughed. "Even better. You've made enough mistakes to know which ones cost money." That sentence changed something inside me. Not immediately, but enough. Over the following weeks, I enrolled in evening business classes at the local community college. Walking into those classrooms was intimidating. Many students were younger than my own children. I worried I'd be the oldest person there. Sometimes I was, sometimes I wasn't. Nobody cared nearly as much as I did. I learned updated accounting software, digital marketing basics, modern inventory systems, online retail trends. Every assignment reminded me that experience still mattered when paired with a willingness to keep learning. One evening, my instructor returned a project with a handwritten note. "Your recommendations are practical because they've been lived, not imagined." I kept that paper. It's still in my desk drawer today. My first opportunity came through pure coincidence. The owner of a neighborhood gift shop mentioned she couldn't understand why sales kept dropping, even though customer traffic looked steady. I offered to take a look. She laughed. "You mean for free?" "For now." I spent 3 afternoons watching customers move through her store. The problem wasn't the products. It was the layout. Popular items were hidden. Seasonal displays blocked visibility. Employees greeted shoppers inconsistently. Simple things. Things I'd noticed automatically for years. After rearranging merchandise and retraining staff, her monthly sales increased enough to cover my small consulting fee several times over. She hugged me when she handed me my first check. It wasn't a large check, a few $100s, but I stared at it in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. It wasn't about the money. It was proof. Proof that I still had something valuable to offer. Word spread slowly. One store owner told another, then another. I built a simple website, printed business cards, opened a small office. Every client represented another piece of confidence returning to me. Looking back now, I realize Richard and Diane never asked what became of me after the divorce. Perhaps they assumed I had stayed exactly where they left me. Some people mistake silence for failure. They assume that if you aren't announcing every step forward, you aren't moving at all. As I finished my coffee that morning after the mall encounter, my receptionist knocked lightly on my office door. "Your 10 o'clock just arrived." I smiled. "Send them in." Because while Richard and Diane had been busy remembering the woman they thought they'd destroyed, I'd been quietly becoming someone entirely different. They simply hadn't noticed. The week after my encounter with Richard and Diane at the mall, life settled back into its familiar rhythm. That may sound disappointing if you're expecting dramatic confrontations or sleepless nights filled with schemes for revenge. But that's the funny thing about rebuilding your life. Eventually, your own future becomes more interesting than someone else's past. Monday mornings still began with coffee in my office before anyone else arrived. Tuesday afternoons usually meant visiting one of my retail clients. Wednesday evenings I volunteered at our church's food pantry where I packed canned goods alongside people who never once asked about my divorce. They cared whether we had enough peanut butter and soup for the families coming on Thursday. There was something comforting about that. The world keeps moving even when our hearts believe it should stop. By then, Carter Retail Solutions had grown far beyond anything I'd imagined during those lonely months after the divorce. I wasn't running a large corporation. That had never been my goal. I employed 2 full-time associates and 1 retired accountant who worked 3 days a week because, as he liked to joke, his wife had informed him that retirement wasn't supposed to mean following her around the house all day. Most of our clients were family-owned businesses: independent bookstores, hardware stores, gift shops, small clothing boutiques, kitchen supply stores, the kinds of places that gave a downtown its personality. Those businesses were facing challenges from every direction. Online shopping had changed customer habits. Large chain stores could negotiate lower prices. Commercial rents seemed to rise every year. Owners who had spent decades building their businesses suddenly felt as though the rules had changed overnight. I understood that feeling. Not because I owned their stores, because I'd had to rebuild my own life after believing the rules of my marriage would never change. One Thursday morning, I visited a family-owned shoe store that had been operating for nearly 50 years. The owner, Harold, met me at the front door. "I'm embarrassed you have to see the place like this," he admitted. The shelves looked cluttered. Boxes filled aisles that should have been clear. Employees seemed busy but unfocused. I smiled. "Harold, I've seen worse." He laughed. "I was hoping you'd say that." For the next several hours, we walked through every department. I asked questions. I listened. I watched customers. I noticed little things. A grandmother searching for children's shoes couldn't find anyone to help. The checkout counter blocked the view of a seasonal display. Signs advertised sales that had ended 2 months earlier. Nothing was catastrophic. But together, those little problems quietly pushed customers away. 3 months later, Harold called me. "I just wanted you to know," he said, his voice filled with excitement, "our sales are up 22% over last year." "I didn't do that," I replied. "You did." "No," I said gently. "You were willing to change. I just helped you see where to start." That became my philosophy. I wasn't there to rescue businesses. I was there to remind owners of strengths they'd stopped noticing. Somewhere along the way, I realized I was speaking to myself as much as I was speaking to them. Around that same time, mutual friends occasionally mentioned Richard, never in a gossipy way. Small towns and longtime communities have a way of passing along ordinary information. Someone would casually say they'd seen him at a charity dinner. Someone else mentioned he'd retired earlier than expected. Another person remarked that Diane had opened 2 additional boutique locations. Whenever those conversations happened, people usually paused, waiting to see how I'd react. I simply smiled and asked about something else. The truth was, I didn't spend much time thinking about them anymore. That surprised me more than anyone else. For so long, I'd imagined healing meant forgetting. Instead, it meant remembering without hurting. One Saturday afternoon, Melissa came over with my 2 granddaughters. The girls immediately raced into the backyard to chase butterflies, while Melissa helped me prepare lunch. As we sliced tomatoes, she glanced at me. "You seem lighter." "I feel lighter," I noticed. She smiled. "I wasn't sure if I should mention it." "You can always mention it." She hesitated. "When Dad left, I worried you'd spend the rest of your life angry." "So did I." "But you didn't." I thought about that before answering. "Being angry is exhausting." She nodded. "I know." "No," I corrected gently. "You know what it looks like. Living with it is different." She reached across the counter and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you." Those 4 words meant more than she probably realized. Not because I needed praise. Because my children had watched me survive one of the hardest chapters of my life. Now they were seeing something else. Peace. Meanwhile, Richard's retirement wasn't unfolding quite as smoothly as he'd once imagined. I learned that months later, though I didn't know it at the time. After decades in sales, he'd expected retirement to feel like freedom. Instead, it felt like losing his identity. Work had provided structure, recognition, goals. Without it, he drifted. Diane, on the other hand, threw herself into expanding her boutique business. 1 location had become 2, then 3. She leased larger spaces, ordered more inventory, hired additional staff. From the outside, everything looked successful. But appearances can be expensive. Expansion often requires loans. Loans require steady growth. And steady growth rarely happens just because someone wants it to. Richard encouraged her optimism. After all, optimism had served him well throughout his own career. Neither of them seemed interested in asking difficult questions while business looked good. Several months after the mall encounter, I received a phone call from a vice president at a regional bank. "We've heard excellent things about your consulting work, Mrs. Carter." "Thank you. We're working with several retail businesses experiencing financial difficulties. We'd like an independent operational assessment before making decisions regarding restructuring." That kind of assignment was larger than my typical projects. Naturally, I accepted. The following Tuesday, a courier delivered several thick folders containing financial statements, lease agreements, inventory reports, and operating summaries for 6 different businesses. I carried the stack into my office and began reviewing them one at a time. The first was a sporting goods store. The second, a kitchen supply retailer. The third, a boutique clothing chain. I stopped reading. The company name sounded familiar. Very familiar? I turned another page. There it was. Owner Diane Lawson, my former best friend. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window. The reports painted a troubling picture. Rapid expansion. Declining cash flow. Inventory that wasn't moving. Growing debt obligations. On paper, the problems were obvious. Emotionally, they were anything but. I picked up the phone and called the bank. "I need to disclose something." The vice president listened carefully as I explained my previous relationship with the owner. After a long pause, he asked one question. "Can you remain objective?" I looked down at the financial reports spread across my desk. 3 years earlier, I honestly couldn't have answered yes. Now I could. "I can. We chose you because your reputation is built on professionalism." After hanging up, I sat quietly for several minutes. Life had placed something unexpected in front of me. Not an opportunity for revenge. An opportunity to discover whether I'd truly become the woman I believed I was. The difference mattered more than anyone else would ever know. Because dignity isn't measured by how we treat friends. It's revealed by how we treat people who once gave us every reason not to be kind. The conference room overlooked downtown Columbus, though the gray November sky made the city seem softer than usual. I arrived 20 minutes early, as I always did, carrying a leather portfolio that had become worn around the edges after years of client meetings. Old habits have a way of grounding us. When I managed retail stores years earlier, I believed showing up early was a sign of respect. Now I knew it was also a gift to myself. Those quiet minutes before a meeting gave me time to organize my thoughts, review my notes, and leave my emotions outside the room. I needed that more than ever today. The bank had asked me to present my findings regarding Diane's boutique chain. Everything I intended to say was supported by numbers. But everyone in that room knew there was another history sitting quietly beneath the spreadsheets. At precisely 10 o'clock, the conference room door opened. The bank's vice president entered, first followed by 2 commercial lending officers. Then Richard walked in. Diane followed a step behind him. For just a moment, no one spoke. Richard looked older than I remembered from the mall only a few months earlier. Not dramatically. Just tired. Retirement had taken away the confidence that work once supplied him. His shoulders seemed heavier. The lines around his eyes had deepened. Diane, still dressed beautifully, wearing a tailored navy suit with a silk scarf tied neatly around her neck. But I noticed something I never would have seen years ago. She looked anxious. Her smile disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. The bank vice president broke the silence. "Thank you, everyone, for coming." We exchanged polite greetings. Nothing more. No awkward references to the past. No forced attempts at friendliness. Just professionals preparing for a difficult conversation. As everyone settled into their chairs, I opened my portfolio. "I appreciate the opportunity to review your operations," I began. My voice surprised even me. Calm, steady. The same voice I used with every client. I clicked to the first slide of my presentation. "I'm going to focus on operational issues rather than personal decisions. My role is to identify what's working, what isn't, and what changes may improve long-term stability." The lending officers nodded. Richard folded his arms. Diane sat very still. I spent the next 40 minutes walking through my analysis. Store by store. Location by location. The strongest location remained profitable despite increased competition. The second location struggled with declining foot traffic after several neighboring businesses closed. The newest location had opened before the existing stores generated enough consistent cash flow to support another expansion. Inventory levels had nearly doubled in less than 2 years. Much of that inventory consisted of seasonal merchandise that had missed its selling window. Storage costs continued increasing. Discounts reduced profit margins. Marketing expenses had climbed without producing enough new customers. None of these issues alone would destroy a business. Together they created a dangerous pattern. I spoke carefully. Not because I wanted to protect Diane's feelings, because accuracy matters, especially when someone's livelihood is involved. When I finished reviewing the financial trends, I paused. The encouraging news, I said, is that these problems are reversible. For the first time since the meeting began, Diane looked directly at me. How? It was a simple question. Not defensive, not sarcastic, just tired. I turned another page, closed the weakest location before it drains the healthier ones. Richard shifted in his chair. I continued. Reduce inventory by focusing on best-selling product lines instead of carrying excessive variety. Another recommendation. Renegotiate supplier agreements. Another. Improve staff scheduling to match customer traffic instead of fixed shifts. I explained each suggestion in plain language. No complicated business jargon. Good advice shouldn't require a dictionary. When I finished, silence filled the room. One of the lending officers finally spoke. Mrs. Carter, based on your experience, do you believe this business can recover? Yes. Diane blinked. Richard uncrossed his arms. But only, I continued, if difficult decisions are made quickly. Waiting 6 more months would significantly reduce those options. Richard leaned forward. I disagree with some of your assumptions. His voice remained polite, though frustration lingered beneath the surface. I nodded. Which ones? He pointed toward one of the financial charts. You've underestimated customer loyalty. I hope I have. Our clients know Diane personally. I believe many do. So they'll stay. I folded my hands. Customer loyalty is valuable, but loyalty doesn't eliminate debt payments, lease obligations, or inventory costs. Loyal customers still have budgets. The room grew quiet again. The bank vice president spoke next. Our internal analysis reached similar conclusions. Richard looked from him to me, then back again. He didn't argue further. Diane slowly closed the folder in front of her. I knew things weren't perfect, she admitted quietly. I just didn't realize how quickly they were slipping. Nobody judged her. Business ownership humbles almost everyone eventually. The meeting continued for another half hour as we discussed timelines, financing options, and restructuring plans. Throughout the entire conversation, not once did I mention our personal history. Not once did I refer to the affair. Not once did I remind either of them about the afternoon at the mall. Those moments belonged somewhere else. Not here. Professionalism isn't pretending the past never happened. It's refusing to let the past decide your behavior in the present. As the meeting ended, everyone gathered their papers. The lending officers left first. The vice president excused himself to answer a phone call. Within seconds, only Richard, Diane, and I remained. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Diane finally stood. I'll wait outside. Richard nodded. After she closed the door behind her, he remained standing beside the conference table. For several moments he simply looked at me. Not with anger, not with pity, with confusion. I don't understand something. What is it? How did you learn all this? I almost smiled. The question wasn't really about business. It was about the woman sitting across from him. He remembered the wife who had rearranged furniture for family gatherings, packed school lunches, remembered birthdays, and quietly supported his career. He had never bothered to notice everything else. I answered honestly. I didn't suddenly become capable. He frowned slightly. I spent decades learning how businesses work. I just stopped believing those skills mattered. He looked down at the conference table. I never saw that. I know. Another silence. Then he asked almost to himself, when did you change? I considered the question carefully before answering. I learned what I was capable of after the people I trusted stopped believing in me. His eyes filled with something I hadn't expected. Regret. Not dramatic regret. The quiet kind that arrives years too late. He opened his mouth as if to say something else, then closed it again. Sometimes there aren't enough words. I picked up my portfolio. I hope the recommendations help. They will, he said softly. I nodded once, then walked toward the door. This time when I passed Richard, neither of us looked back. The meeting had never been about proving I was stronger than him. It had been about proving I no longer needed to. 3 weeks after the meeting at the bank, I was trimming the last of my rose bushes before winter when my cell phone rang. The number wasn't in my contacts. Normally, I let unfamiliar calls go to voicemail. That afternoon, for reasons I still can't explain, I answered. Hello. There was a brief pause. Then I heard a voice I hadn't expected. Evelyn, it's Richard. For a moment neither of us spoke. The breeze carried a few dry leaves across the front yard, and somewhere down the street a lawnmower hummed steadily. Ordinary sounds. The kind that remind you life keeps moving even during uncomfortable conversations. "I hope I'm not interrupting you," he said. "Not at all." "I was wondering," he hesitated, "would you be willing to meet for coffee?" I looked down at the gardening gloves in my hands. 3 years earlier, I would have spent hours wondering what he wanted. Now my first thought was much simpler. Did I want to go? Surprisingly, the answer came easily. All right. We agreed to meet the following Tuesday morning at a locally owned coffee shop we'd never visited together during our marriage. I preferred it that way. Some conversations deserve neutral ground. When I arrived, Richard was already seated near the window with 2 cups of coffee waiting on the table. He stood as I approached. "You still take it with just a little cream?" I smiled politely. "I've become predictable in my old age." He chuckled. "I think we've both earned that privilege." We sat down. For the first few minutes, the conversation stayed safely on ordinary subjects. The weather, our grandchildren, how quickly the year had passed. It felt strangely similar to talking with an old neighbor. Then Richard folded his hands around his coffee cup. "I owe you an apology." I didn't interrupt. "I should have apologized years ago." He looked out the window before continuing. "I've spent a long time telling myself that leaving the marriage was simply following my heart." He shook his head. "That's not the whole truth." I waited. "The truth is," he said quietly, "I enjoyed feeling admired." That sentence carried more honesty than anything I'd heard from him in years. My job made me feel important. The travel, the promotions, the attention. Somewhere along the way I started believing I deserved more than ordinary life. "You called it settling," I said softly. He closed his eyes for a moment. "I remember?" "I never forgot." "I know." He took a slow breath. "Looking back, I wasn't unhappy because of you. I was restless because I didn't know who I was without constant praise." That sounded painfully believable. Retirement had stripped away the applause his career once provided. Without it, he had been forced to meet himself honestly. "The comment at the mall," he continued, his voice lower now. "I've thought about it almost every day." I remembered every word. "I can almost smell the desperation," I repeated. He nodded, ashamed. "I wanted to believe you needed me." I looked at him steadily. "Why, because if you were doing fine without me," he sighed, "then I had to face what I'd actually thrown away." There it was. Not an excuse. An admission. "I was embarrassed," he said. "Not by you, by myself." For the first time since our divorce, I saw the frightened man behind the confident salesman. Age has a way of removing the masks we once wore so comfortably. "I underestimated you," he continued. "I underestimated myself," I replied. He smiled sadly. "I suppose we both did." We sat quietly for a while. There wasn't any anger left in me. Just curiosity. "How are things with Diane?" I finally asked. He answered honestly. "Complicated." I appreciated that he didn't pretend everything was perfect. "We're working hard to save the business." "And your marriage?" He gave a tired smile. "We're trying to build one." The distinction didn't escape either of us. Relationships born in excitement eventually have to survive ordinary life. Some do, some don't. "Your recommendations are helping," he said after another pause. "The bank agreed to restructure the loans. Diane closed the weakest location last week. I'm glad. I wasn't sure you'd even agree to evaluate the business." I wasn't sure either. He studied me for a long moment. "Why did you?" I answered without hesitation. "Because I didn't want the worst thing that ever happened to me to become the reason I stopped being the person I wanted to be." He slowly nodded. "I wish I'd understood that years ago." "So do I." When we stood to leave, Richard extended his hand. Then almost awkwardly he lowered it again. "I don't know what's appropriate anymore." I smiled gently. "A handshake is fine." We shook hands. Simple. Respectful. Final. As I walked toward my car, I realized something unexpected. His apology hadn't changed my past. It had simply removed the last question I didn't know I was still carrying. 2 weeks later, my office receptionist announced an unexpected visitor. "Evelyn." "Yes, Diane Lawson is here." I looked up from my paperwork. "Send her in." Diane entered slowly, carrying no purse, no shopping bags, no polished confidence. Just herself. She sat down before speaking. "I almost turned around 3 times in the parking lot." "I believe you." She gave a nervous laugh. "I've rehearsed this conversation for days. So stop rehearsing." That made her smile for the first time. Fair enough. She folded her hands tightly. I've spent years telling myself our relationship started because Richard and I fell in love. She looked directly at me. That wasn't the beginning. I listened quietly. The beginning was envy. Those words surprised me more than anything else she could have said. I envied your family. My family. You always seemed so steady. She searched for the right word. You never had to be the center of attention. People trusted you. Your children called you for advice. Friends relied on you. She laughed softly. I mistook that for an ordinary life. I remembered something she'd once said. Nobody should settle. She nodded slowly. I thought excitement was happiness. And now I know peace has value. Neither of us pretended the past hadn't happened. Some wounds leave scars. Scars don't disappear. They simply stop hurting every time you notice them. I can't undo what I did, she said. No, I don't expect forgiveness. I considered that carefully. I think forgiveness is often misunderstood. She waited. It doesn't mean pretending something was acceptable. No, it means refusing to let it control the rest of your life. She looked down at her hands. I've been hoping you'd say you hated me. I did. She looked up. For a while. And now I hope you become someone you can respect. Tears filled her eyes. Not dramatic tears. Quiet ones. The kind that arrive when someone tells you the truth without trying to hurt you. When she left my office, I didn't know what the future held for Richard and Diane. That wasn't my responsibility anymore. What mattered was something much simpler. For the first time in years, the three of us had stopped hiding behind excuses. Truth, even when it arrives late, has a remarkable way of making room for peace. Winter slowly gave way to spring just as it always had. The tulips I planted after my divorce pushed through the soil again, bright and determined, reminding me that some things keep returning no matter how harsh the season before them may have been. Every morning I walked past them on my way to the car before driving to the office. Those flowers had become a quiet symbol in my life. Not because they were extraordinary, because they showed up anyway. That's what rebuilding often looks like. You don't suddenly become fearless. You simply keep showing up. Over the next several months, Carter Retail Solutions continued to grow not rapidly but steadily, which I had learned was a far healthier way to measure success. I turned down projects that would have required constant travel. At 63, I no longer believed every opportunity had to be accepted. Freedom isn't having the busiest calendar. Freedom is deciding which parts of life deserve your time. Instead, I focused on something that mattered even more to me, helping people my own age discover they weren't finished yet. Every other Wednesday evening, our conference room filled with men and women in their late 50s, 60s, and 70s. Some had retired and wanted a second career. Some had lost spouses. Others had gone through divorces that left them wondering who they were without the life they'd planned. I called the workshop Second Chapters. We talked about practical things. Writing modern résumé, learning new technology, starting small businesses, building confidence after years away from the workforce. But we also talked about something less practical. Hope. One evening, a gentleman named Walter raised his hand. I'll be honest, he admitted. I'm 68. Who's going to hire me? Several people nodded. I smiled because I remembered asking myself almost the same question. I don't know who will hire you, I answered, but I do know this. The room grew quiet. Experience doesn't become worthless just because birthdays keep arriving. Walter chuckled. I needed to hear that. No, I said warmly. You needed to remember it. By the end of the meeting, everyone was exchanging phone numbers, offering advice, and encouraging one another. Watching that happen gave me more satisfaction than signing any consulting contract ever could. Helping someone believe in tomorrow is meaningful work. Around the same time, I heard occasional updates about Diane's business. She had followed nearly every recommendation from my report. She closed one location, renegotiated leases, reduced excess inventory, and simplified the product lines. It hadn't been easy. Several employees had to be transferred. Some difficult conversations had taken place. But the business stabilized. Not because of me alone. Because she finally made decisions based on reality instead of pride. Richard also seemed different whenever our paths crossed at community events. He smiled more gently now. He listened more than he spoke. Age has a curious way of teaching lessons that success often postpones. One Saturday in May, Melissa invited the whole family to my oldest granddaughter's elementary school music program. The school auditorium buzzed with grandparents carrying flowers, parents balancing cameras, and children whispering excitedly behind the curtain. I found a seat near the front beside my son and his family. As we waited for the program to begin, I noticed someone standing several rows behind us. Richard. Beside him stood Diane, our granddaughter, spotted all of us before the performance started and waved enthusiastically with both hands. She didn't see divided families. She saw people who loved her. That simple truth touched me more deeply than I expected. After the concert ended, children ran toward waiting families. Our granddaughter threw her arms around me first. "Grandma, did you hear my solo? I wouldn't have missed it for the world." She beamed proudly. A few moments later, Richard approached. There was no awkwardness this time, only familiarity shaped by time. "She did wonderfully," he said. "The best singer in the room," I replied. He laughed. "I think every grandparent here is saying the same thing." "Then we're all probably right?" For a moment we watched our granddaughter chatter excitedly with her cousins. Then Richard turned toward me. "I've been meaning to tell you something." I waited. "The business finished the quarter in the black." "That's wonderful news." "It is," he nodded thoughtfully. "You helped save it." "Diane saved it. You gave her the chance." I smiled. "She chose to use it." He looked at me with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." Those two words felt very different now than they would have years earlier. There was no expectation attached to them. No hidden hope. No unfinished business. Just appreciation. As he walked back toward Diane, I realized something that surprised me. There had been a time when seeing the two of them together would have reopened every wound. Now it simply reminded me how far all of us had traveled. Not toward perfection. Toward honesty. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea as the sun slipped below the trees. The same backyard where I had once sat wondering whether my life was over. I thought about the afternoon at the mall. Richard's smirk. Diane's offer of an $18 an hour job. The business card. The dropped phone. For a long time I believed that moment had been my revenge. But I understand it differently now. The business card wasn't powerful because it embarrassed them. It was powerful because it represented every morning I chose to get up when staying in bed felt easier. Every class I attended despite feeling out of place. Every client who trusted me. Every mistake that taught me something useful. Every tear that eventually made room for hope. The greatest victory wasn't proving Richard wrong. It was proving to myself that my worth had never depended on whether someone else recognized it. If there's one lesson these years have taught me, it's this. People can betray your trust. They can misunderstand your value. They can walk away from promises they once made, but they cannot decide who you become afterward. Only you can make that choice. And sometimes the most meaningful form of revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living so fully, so honestly, and so peacefully that bitterness no longer has a place to live inside your heart. If my story has reminded you that it's never too late to begin again, I hope you'll hold on to that thought the next time life asks more of you than you think you can give. And if you've ever rebuilt your life after heartbreak, loss, retirement, or disappointment, I'd love for you to share your story. Someone else may need the hope you've earned. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this journey spoke to your heart, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need the reminder that second chances are real, and you're always welcome to return for another story.